talk, I kind of want everybody to like loosen up. So if everybody wants to get up, we're gonna do a little dance. Come on.
You guys are being invited
to hop on up. Let's celebrate. I kind of want to just give a big round of applause to the organizers for doing an incredible job. Were you gonna like lift me or something? Can we give a big round of applause to the organizers? Oh my God, good turns, whoa. Okay, thank you so much for dancing with me. I'm so honored to get to close out this last JSConf AU. It's so bittersweet that this is the last time that this is all gonna be put together, but I'm sure that we'll all get together again soon. My name is Patricia, and I've had many, many past lives, but for now, I'm a front-end developer. And when I began teaching myself JavaScript and when I got involved in the JavaScript community, I finally joined our beloved trash fire that is Twitter. And the thing that I noticed that was the most peculiar to me was that there was this perennial debate that kept happening about whether or not a hot dog was a sandwich. And at first I was like, is this just, like in my microcosm of friends, is this just something that I happen to be seeing because of like confirmation bias? Or is like, and I was like, no, because Silicon Valley just recently did a joke about it on their show. They made an app called Not Hot Dog, where you could take a picture of something and it would tell you if it was a hot dog or if it was not a hot dog. And so in the show, they take a bunch of pictures of sandwiches and they're like, oh, not a hot dog, but then they take a picture of a hot dog and they're like, yep, that's a hot dog. So I started asking my friends what was going on. Why was this debate happening? Why was this such a hot topic? And they told me that the reason why was because of ontology. And I was like metaphysics? Like, is this some kind of Matrix meme that I'm not in on? Like, what? For me, ontology is like the study of the nature of being and reality. So I was very confused, and they were like, no. This is ontology, which is in information science, which is the formal naming and definition of types, properties, and interrelationships of entities in a domain of discourse. So basically, it's just a fancy way of saying categorizing shit. And so we use ontology in computer science to limit complexity and organize information. But for me, it was so forced. For me, I saw a hot dog and like, it made my blood boil to hear this argument over and over and over again because I felt like they were trying to stick a round peg through a square hole. And I was like, you guys, they're not, or everybody, they're not hot dogs. Like, hot dogs are not sandwiches. Hot dogs are most like tacos. Like, why can't you stop talking? Like, why are you still talking about sandwiches? Because it really bothered me because what it demonstrated to me was the way that all of our unconscious bias is used and manipulates even our own minds when we don't realize it to reinforce existing stereotypes and reinforce existing unconscious bias and existing systems of oppression. Like, the sandwich was invented by Earl of Sandwich in the 1750s. He asked his servant, I hate to use like those words, but anyways, he asked his servant to give him his meals between two pieces of bread. And what happened was he would order that from the gambling table, and his friends were like, I'll have what Sandwich is having. Like, I just read that in quotations, and I would really like to know if that was what actually happened or not. But, because then the When Harry Met Sally scene has a whole different meaning. But, so basically, like, with the help of my friend Justin, we like made this meme to stop this debate because we were just so tired of hearing it. And Justin filled me in on this really great book, which is called Surface and Essence by Douglas Hofstadter and Emmanuel Sanders. And it's all about how analogies are the fuel and fire of thinking. And they say categorization is the pulsating heartbeat of thought, allowing us to exploit the rich storehouse of wisdom rooted in our past. And categorization gives us the feeling of understanding a situation you're in by providing a clear perspective on it, allowing hidden items and qualities to be detected, future events to be anticipated, and the consequences of actions to be foreseen. So, by considering how we think we can get to the root of unconscious bias, which is stereotypes, we have to look at these broad generalizations that we use and are reinforcing unconscious bias and systems of oppression through analogies and metaphors that we use every day. To be more inclusive, we have to consider how these analogies are manipulating us. And these are the three most common ways that analogies can be used to manipulate. First, they can be invisible. So anything like just saying the word like, any language that you use has invisible analogies in it. A dictionary is nothing but invisible analogies. Like, how can you define a word without other words? You need analogies to do that. Also, the second most common ways that analogies manipulate us is that they are inaccurate or that they lack nuance. And the last way is propaganda. And the reason why I divided it into these three groups is because the first one involves no intent. There is no intent on the side of the person who is using the analogy or the metaphor to manipulate. The intent is not there, and therefore it would be invisible because it can't be detected. The second example, inaccurate or lacking nuance, is an example of when an analogy or metaphor is manipulating us because of a negligence. So like with the hot dog and sandwich debate, there was a negligence on the part of the people who were arguing that hot dogs were like sandwiches to really consider whether or not those categories were being fed to them by all of their past knowledge, or whether they were actually going out of their way to figure out what was the best way to categorize a hot dog. And the last way is obviously, propaganda obviously has an intent. It's meant to, these analogies are meant to manipulate us and execute the agenda of the author. So we're mostly gonna be focusing on inaccuracy, lack of nuance, and invisibility. And because metaphors are dangerous, metaphors are not to be trifled with. A single metaphor can give birth to love. This is one of my favorite quotations from The Unbearable Lightness of Being by Milan Kundera. Metaphors are the stuff of life, and we need to be careful and question them in order to bridge the gap between us and the others that we don't understand, that we don't know how to connect with. Claude Steele is the author of a book called Whistling Vivaldi. He's a social psychologist and researcher at Columbia University, and he wrote this book, Whistling Vivaldi, about his research into stereotypes and how they manipulate us and how we can break them down and whether or not they actually have an effect on us. And after many, many experiments that were redone by many, many other social psychologists behind him, he used a kind of language that I really appreciated because I felt like it got to the crux of the issue and the reason why we have so much difficulty bridging this gap and tearing down our unconscious bias. And that's that he inverted the conversation for me. So instead of talking about privilege and instead of talking about all of the ways that we benefit, which privilege is not bad. Privilege is not inherently bad. When we talk about privilege, we're talking about the things that you get that make your life easier. We're not talking about how you're costing someone else something. However, that does enter into the equation, and that is why I think that there's so much difficulty understanding these concepts. And so I'd like you to take a moment and invert these concepts in your thought, and instead of thinking about privilege when you think about the inequalities in the world, think about stereotype threat, which is what underrepresented minorities experience. It's a combination of stigma pressure and identity contingencies. Identity contingencies exist for everyone. When a white cis male signs up for a class on African American history, he has an identity contingency that is going to create stigma pressure and therefore will have a stereotype threat in that class. So by inverting this, sorry, excuse me, I lost my voice on the plane. So by inverting this and considering stereotype threat, we can see the conversation from the other point of view. Excuse me. Sorry. So instead of subjugating us to, instead of talking about the things that you have to deal with when you're in a situation because you have a given social identity, we should consider the circumstances you have to deal with, because as an underrepresented minority, I'm always aware of what other people could think. I'm always living in two different worlds. And we should have put the dancing in here at this time. It's really hard to talk for 35 minutes straight when you're losing your voice. I'll take a lozenge real quick. Steele talks about in Whistling Vivaldi. Oh my God, am I ever going to be able to finish this sentence? The work of Edward Jones and Richard Nesbitt and how they explain how these different things manifest in the world. And they explain it by talking about observer's perspective and actor's perspective, which is that, so they talk about observer's perspective and actor's perspective and how observers emphasize what they can see and they de-emphasize things that they can't see. They de-emphasize how the systems of oppression that are not obvious to them. And as an underrepresented minority, and the actor's perspective, these are things that we're hyper aware of. These are things that influence every single decision that we make. For example, people talk a lot about male chivalry, but there's also female chivalry, which is this concept of like women being performative, doing our hair, being subversive, you know, putting on nice outfits. Like that is female chivalry. That is the actor's perspective side of the equation that people don't see. And when we can't see inequalities, they manifest more quickly, and they manifest as socioeconomic disadvantage, segregated social practices, and restrictive cultural orientations. The other side of actors' perspective is very perfectly described here by W.E.B. Du Bois in The Soul of Black Folk, which was published in 1903, and I highly recommend that everyone take a minute to read it. But basically, W.E.B. Du Bois created this concept of double consciousness, which is that as an underrepresented minority, you're always aware of the multiple worlds that you exist in. You exist in your own world of your own identities, and that can be multifaceted, depending on your sexual orientation, your gender, if you're ill or not. And this causes cognitive dissonance. It makes it more difficult to operate in the world. So, and this leads me to like something else that is really important to me. This is something that happens on teams very often, which is Ringelmann Effect, which is where as the group grows, individual productivity drops. And the reason why this affects URMs the most is because privilege works as social capital. And it allows people to do what is called social loafing. So you see here, TJ Miller is just enjoying a hit off of a bong while everybody else is working around him, right? That's social loafing. And what happens is underrepresented minorities pick up the slack. So to reduce this from happening, to keep this from happening, you have to limit your scope of your projects. You have to keep your groups small. You have to divvy up responsibilities equitably, and you have to reward coordination and cooperation. And because people like getting credit, you're gonna have a happier team, a more psychologically safe team, and a better community. Is my lipstick okay? So, Ringelmann effect is one thing that can happen. Another thing that can happen is called bystander effect. Bystander effect was researched by John Darley and Bibb Latney in 1968 after the death of Kitty Genovese in 1964. At 3 a.m., she was attacked over the course of the entire rest of the evening and morning. And the New York Times published that 37 people witnessed her attack, but in reality, it was more like about a dozen people. But imagine that you are out in the middle of the street and someone attacks you, and 12 people walk past and don't do anything about it. And so this really inspired these two social researchers to look into why this was happening. They did a number of different experiments. One of my favorites was the smoke room experiment, where they put a person in a room with a questionnaire, and then they released smoke into the room, and they tested to see how long it took before they reported that there was smoke coming into the room. And as the group increased, as more people were in the room filling out the survey, the length of time that it took to report what was happening went up dramatically. And that's because of diffusion of responsibility. So what they noted was that with bystander effect, what happens is you notice, interpret, assess degree of responsibility, form assistance, and implement an action choice. And that action choice can be direct intervention, detour intervention, or no intervention. And bias prevents people from directly helping those that need help, from directly helping people that absolutely could be advantaged by the privilege that you can offer. So Darley and Latney found that responsibility depends on whether or not we feel that the person who needs help deserves it, our competence, and our relationship to them. And detour intervention doesn't work in situations of bias because the systems of oppression that already exist don't allow for help. So how do we do effective direct intervention? How do we help the people who need to be helped? In the 1970s in New York, crime was really high in the subways. It was practically unsafe to go on the subway. But this organization called the Guardian Angels came together, and their membership was mostly young men, Black and Latino, who had eschewed gang life in their own neighborhoods to better their city. They had this system that I love. It was fantastic. What they did was they put one person on each subway car, and if a fight broke out or if someone got attacked on a subway car, they would know because at every subway stop, they all poked their heads out the subway door and checked to make sure that everyone was visible. And if someone wasn't visible, they would know that the person in that subway car needed assistance, and they would all run to that subway car to help. They did this despite the fact that the police were calling them vigilantes, despite the fact that they were at first shunned by many, and over time, because they helped so many people, the attitude of the public turned around. In a few years, the public was able to go on the subway safely. They were able to enjoy their city again, and it is because of the Guardian Angels that the subway got cleaned up in the 80s. Another example of direct intervention that worked despite a system of oppression not helping is something that was described on Reply All's Writing on the Wall episode. At Colgate University in upstate New York, the Black Student Union leaders were getting direct death threats through the anonymous messaging app Yik Yak, and the administration of the school refused to do anything about it. They refused to contact Yik Yak and ask them about the people who were posting these death threats. They refused to do any punishment when they found out who these people were. And so what happened was assistant professor of biology, Jeff Holmes, started this campaign that he called the Yik Yak Take Back. And it was a social media campaign akin to sending Ned Flanders to comment on 4chan. The rules were that professors needed to go on, and all they had to do was sign their name. But and he encouraged them to post messages of well wishes, messages about joking about how hard the midterm was going to be, broadcasting congratulations to students on finishing their thesis. And what he did was by using his privilege, he witnessed these death threats, and it created this environment where it was no longer a place where it was acceptable to post these kinds of messages because the professors got involved and they directly intervened. We have to get directly involved to make change. And we have to recognize when an underrepresented minority points out bad behavior, we are challenging you to be better. If we felt that your intent was malicious or bad in any way, shape, or form, I promise you, underrepresented minorities are going to disengage. They're going to block you on social media. They're not going to risk their own safety to tell you that they think that you were wrong. When we feel that we are in danger, we know to tend and befriend. We know to go to our groups because a group is more likely to survive harassment than an individual. But when we see bad behavior and we trust that the person has good intentions, we're going to call it out. And when it gets called out, it's best if you listen, internalize, apologize, be accountable for your actions, and be attentive to the ways that that was part of your unconscious bias so that you can take it out of your unconscious bias, so that you can be conscious of those moments. Because we care too much to stop demanding more. This is a matter of our safety. This isn't a matter of what we like to do or what we don't like to do. I don't like having to confront my friends when they say something inappropriate. I don't like having to confront people on Twitter about a comment or a word that was used that was ableist. But it's what we need to do in order to make a better society. Each choice is an opportunity to influence the world that we exist in. Sartre, when he wrote On Being and Nothingness, wrote notes about creating an ethical model to pair with his existential philosophy, but he never got beyond notes. Simone de Beauvoir did. She wrote Ethics of Ambiguity, which perfectly encapsulates, I looked for years for an ethical model that I felt matched what I was internally feeling, because I know that there's nothing new under the sun, and someone must have written it. And what's fascinating to me is that her book isn't even mentioned on Wikipedia's page for existentialism. It's a direct response to On Being and Nothingness. It's not mentioned in most philosophy curriculums. But she wrote about how because we have freedom, and because of existentialism, because of the fact that, like, Sartre killed God and basically said that our choices are our own, it means that we have our own responsibility to make our own choices in each and every moment in order to help not just ourselves, but the society that we choose to participate in. Participating in society, social contract is a choice. And therefore, because social contract is a choice, it is imperative that a moral attitude be adopted as well. So after discussing all of this high-end, social theory, let's look at another example where unconscious bias exists. So here's an analogy that's so pervasive that we usually wouldn't blink twice. But you might not have known this, but actually, before the compass was invented, east used to be at the top of the map because the sun would rise in the east. And so maps were oriented with east at the top. But when you see this analogy that west to east is equal to left to right, your mind doesn't think about it. It's an invisible analogy. And how does this apply to us as developers? Well, honestly, the West Wing does a much better job of explaining this than I do. So
we'd like President Bartlett to aggressively support legislation that would make it mandatory for every public school in America to teach geography using the Peters projection map instead of the traditional Mercator.
Give me $200 and it's done.
Really?
No. Why are we changing maps?
Because, CJ, the Mercator Projection has fostered European imperialist attitudes for centuries and created an ethnic bias against the Third World.
Really?
The German cartographer, Mercator, originally designed this map in 1569 as a navigational tool for European sailors.
The map enlarges areas at the poles to create straight lines of constant bearing or geographic direction.
So it makes it easier to cross an ocean.
But
yes,
it distorts the relative size of nations and continents.
Are you saying the map is wrong?
Oh dear, yes. Look at Greenland.
Okay.
Now look at Africa.
Okay.
The two land masses appear to be roughly the same size.
Yes.
Would it blow your mind if I told you that Africa is in reality 14 times larger?
Yes.
Here we have Europe, drawn considerably larger than South America. When it's 6.9 million square miles, South America is almost double the size of Europe's 3.8 million.
Alaska appears 3 times as large as Mexico, when Mexico is larger by 0.1 million square miles.
Germany appears in the middle of the map when it's in the northernmost quarter of the Earth.
Wait. relative size is one thing, but you're telling me that Germany isn't where we think it is?
Nothing's where you think it is.
Where is it?
I'm glad you asked. The Peters projection.
It has fidelity of axis.
Fidelity of position.
East-west lines are parallel and intersect north-south axes at right angles.
What the hell is that?
It's where you've been living this whole time. Should we continue?
Uh-huh.
Wait, there's a little more.
So, you're probably wondering what all of this has to do with social equality.
No, I'm wondering where France really is.
Guys, we want to thank you very much for coming in.
Hang on, we're gonna finish this.
Okay.
What do maps have to do with social equality, you ask?
She asked.
Salvatore Natoli of the National Council for Social Studies argues, in our society, we unconsciously equate size with importance and even power.
I'm going to check in on Toby.
Go.
These guys find Brigadoon on that map. You'll call me, right?
Probably not.
Okay.
When third world countries are misrepresented, they're likely to be valued less. When Mercator maps exaggerate the importance of Western civilization, when the top of the map is given to the northern hemisphere and the bottom is given to the southern, then people will tend to adopt top and bottom attitudes.
But wait, where else could you put the northern hemisphere but on the top?
On the bottom.
How?
Like this.
Yeah, but you can't do that.
Why not?
Because it's freaking me out.
Who doesn't love CJ Craig? So this is the Gale Peters projection that they showed. The previous map was the Mercator projection. And Peters came up with, he described his reasoning for working on this as because he saw that the Mercator projection was like the cartographic imperialism of the time. However, any map that lays flat is naturally distorted. Even this projection is distorted. So I'm not even going to show you what it would look like upside down because I don't want to freak you out any more than you probably already are. But as in politics, all identities are local. And I say that because as developers, one of the things that we work with the most is actually maps. It's how I got started developing. I joined Maptime LA and worked on mapping projects with OpenStreetMaps. And in the OpenStreetMap community, they call the Google Map strategy the Starbucks test, which is that they only invest money into mapping when it's close enough to, it's a close radius to a chain coffee store. And experts estimate that, and so like OpenStreetMaps does this work to map in areas that are less accessible, but experts estimate that 2 to 5% of OpenStreetMap contributors are women, only 2 to 5%. But the humanitarian OpenStreetMaps team did a gender equality study recently that found that 28% of remote mappers are women, so remote mappers in underserviced parts of the world. And when working directly with people from communities in desperate areas, 48% were women. That's equality. 48% is equality. But keep in mind that the barrier of entry for these women is much higher. These are in parts of the world where the gender norms mean that the women have much more work that they have to do. On top of that, they're volunteering their own personal time to go and map in crises in Puerto Rico, in Tasmania, in Africa. Like, these are people who they could be putting their time towards their own personal lives, but instead they volunteer it. Because mapping is about navigating the world safely, and for women in developing countries, that safety is harder to secure. And we can make a better, more inclusive internet by working on breaking out of these categories that we don't even see that are around us, breaking out of these boxes and questioning the things that, the analogies and the words and the ways that we talk about the world around us, and taking a really hard look at ourselves and considering how unconscious bias plays into our life. Because how can we constantly talk about our love of problem solving, which to me is the soul of engineering, and not want to solve the interpersonal problems on our team and in the world at large? For me, the reason why I do this work, the reason why I do workshops on intersectionality and inclusivity, the reason why I give talks about unconscious bias is because as much fun as it is to solve a bug, these are the problems that are affecting people's lives directly. And these are the issues that really need to be solved first and foremost. So I hope that that inspired you to take a look at your lives. And thank you so much, JS Conf AU. Thank you.